I was getting ready to go to my mother-in-law's funeral when suddenly I got a call. The voice on the other end told me not to attend the funeral and to go back to my parents' house in the countryside immediately. I was confused but followed the instructions and went back to my hometown. Later, I found out from my husband that his estranged sister, Jessica, was causing trouble. She had the nerve to ask how much of the inheritance she would get from my mother-in-law's passing. I was furious that she was trying to profit from the situation. I decided I needed to stand up for my mother-in-law's honor and confront Jessica. After a heated argument, Jessica ended up in trouble. I'm Kristen, a typical housewife married to Charles, who works for a company. We have a happy life together. I know many women struggle with their relationships with their in-laws, especially between a daughter-in-law and mother-in-law, often leading to conflicts. Thankfully, I had a great relationship with my mother-in-law, Charlotte. Charlotte was always kind and supportive. She once knitted a cardigan for me and was always thoughtful about my well-being. I even asked her to teach me how to knit. She had been like a second mother to me, and I was deeply grateful for everything she did, including helping us financially. Charlotte had been battling terminal cancer for a few years and had been undergoing chemotherapy. Her recent death was a shock, and I struggled to eat or cope with the news. But I knew I had to accept it. Whenever I visited Charlotte, she always greeted me with a warm smile. I knew she was trying her best to stay strong for us. I didn't want to just be sad. I wanted to honor her memory with a smile. So I was preparing to go to her funeral at my husband's family home. Then my phone rang. It was my husband's family calling. I figured he might have forgotten something, so I answered the call. But instead of a simple reminder, I heard my husband's panicked voice saying, "Kristen, don't come to the funeral. Go back to your parents' house right away." I was confused and worried. My husband sounded so flustered and didn't explain why. He just told me there was a problem at the venue and that he'd explain later. I agreed to follow his instructions and went to my parents' house. When I arrived, my parents were just as puzzled as I was. They invited me inside to talk, but we had to wait for my husband to explain what was going on. About an hour later, he arrived with his hand wrapped in a bandage. I asked him what happened, and he started explaining. It turned out that my husband has an older sister named Jessica who has caused a lot of trouble for the family. She's had numerous run-ins with the police and created a lot of debt. Despite her behavior, their mother, Charlotte, always tried to help and apologize for Jessica's actions. Charlotte even took responsibility for Jessica's debts. But Jessica betrayed her promise to return home and instead left, causing more issues for the family. Jessica, my husband's estranged sister, had been out of contact with the family for years. Yet on the day of Charlotte's funeral, she showed up at the family home. Instead of expressing condolences, she bluntly asked, "So, how much of the inheritance do I get?" My husband was furious. He told Jessica she had been disinherited long ago and that I, Kristen, was now considered Charlotte's daughter in the eyes of the family. Jessica couldn't believe this. She was enraged and demanded to know why I was the one inheriting instead of her. In her anger, Jessica grabbed my husband's phone and stormed out. As she left, she hurled insults at us. My husband's hand injury was from when she bit him during the confrontation. I quickly locked the phone remotely, but Jessica might have seen our home address and my photos. I was stunned to learn about Charlotte's daughter and shocked by Jessica's terrible behavior. My husband apologized for not telling me about his sister sooner. We decided to stay away from our city home for safety reasons and head to our rural house instead. The next morning, as the sun rose and birds chirped, my husband left for work. He told me to call him on his spare phone if anything came up. I tried to smile and stay positive, but inside I was filled with anxiety. I worried about Jessica showing up or attacking me, and these fears weighed heavily on my mind. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw Jessica's angry face from when she confronted us at my husband's family home. But to my surprise, life at our rural home was peaceful. Days went by without any trouble, and my anxiety slowly faded away. I started to feel more optimistic, hoping the problem with my sister-in-law would just disappear. Then, things changed. One day, a police officer from the local precinct came to our house and asked if Charles and I were home. I felt a bad feeling in my stomach as I asked what was going on. The officer told us that our city home had been broken into. They had just received a call about it. I called Charles to let him know, and we hurried back to the city home. When we arrived, the house was a mess. Every drawer was open, and it looked like a storm had hit. The police officer asked if anything was missing. We checked our house carefully. While most of our valuables seemed safe, a few $100s that had been in our dresser were gone. The officer mentioned that a suspicious woman had been seen around our house recently. She had been shoving things like, "Come out and pay me back," We both thought it might be Jessica. We explained to the police about the trouble with my sister-in-law, including the interrupted funeral, the stolen phone, and my husband's injured hand. The police handled it quickly since we had already reported the stolen phone. We had to give a detailed report at the police station and didn't get back to our rural home until it was getting dark. The officer told us that our city home had been broken into. They had just received a call about it. I called Charles to let him know, and we hurried back to the city home. When we arrived, the house was a mess. Every drawer was open, and it looked like a storm had hit. The police officer asked if anything was missing. We checked our house carefully. While most of our valuables seemed safe, a few $100s that had been in our dresser were gone. The officer mentioned that a suspicious woman had been seen around our house recently. She had been shoving things like, "Come out and pay me back." We both thought it might be Jessica. We explained to the police about the trouble with my sister-in-law, including the interrupted funeral, the stolen phone, and my husband's injured hand. The police handled it quickly since we had already reported the stolen phone. We had to give a detailed report at the police station and didn't get back to our rural home until it was getting dark. The burglar was caught quickly, and as expected, it was Jessica, my sister-in-law. The police found her staying in a hotel near the crime scene, where she was getting a massage and using the money she had stolen from our house. Even though Jessica admitted to the crime, she denied that it was a burglary. It seemed like when family was involved, things weren't so simple. We had to go back to the police station, where we were shown into a room with Jessica sitting there, looking upset. She suddenly blurted out, "Charles, how could you do this to your own family? It's unbelievable." Jessica didn't seem sorry at all. In fact, she acted like she hadn't done anything wrong. She claimed she didn't break into the house to steal. She said she came to talk about inheritance but had to break a window because we were never home. She even said she needed the stolen money just to stay in the hotel. Jessica blamed us for everything. Her selfish attitude made me shiver. If I had run into her alone, I'm not sure what might have happened. Meanwhile, Charles and Jessica were arguing. Charles told her to return his phone and accused her of trying to be part of the family after so many years. Jessica insisted on her right to the inheritance and criticized our mother-in-law, Charlotte, for leaving money to me instead of her own daughter. I couldn't handle her disrespect toward Charlotte and found myself shouting. Jessica responded with anger and accused me of stealing her inheritance. Her intense stare scared me, and I felt a deep sense of unease. I was at a loss for words as Jessica seemed to see right through me. She laughed, acting like she had won. At that moment, the police officer with us cleared his throat and suggested we all calm down. He said we should have a family discussion first and deal with the legal matters later. We later organized a formal meeting at our in-laws' home. The living room, covered with carpets, was filled with Charlotte's relatives around a large table. Jessica was the first to speak. "If you give me my share of the inheritance, I'll let go of all past issues," she said, still as arrogant as ever. It was clear that someone who hadn't changed in over 10 years wasn't going to change now. She kept insisting that we give her the inheritance and drop the charges. Of course, we refused to meet her demands. We had told her repeatedly that she was disinherited and wouldn't get any of Charlotte's inheritance. "Why don't you give me some money after you get the inheritance?" Jessica suggested. "That's not going to happen," Charles said, frustrated. I tried to stay calm and turned to Jessica. "Did you read Charlotte's will? There was a section about you too," I asked. "I only care about the inheritance. The rest is just Charlotte's complaints against me," Jessica replied. "No, Charlotte was concerned about you. She regretted how things turned out," I said. "She didn't give you any money because she knew it wouldn't change you. I won't let someone like you get even a cent of Charlotte's money." Jessica scoffed and said, "You're not even related by blood. You have no right to judge me." I felt a mix of anger and sadness. It was clear Jessica saw Charlotte as just a tool. I told her firmly, "There's nothing more to discuss. Please leave now." I stared back at her, despite her intimidating glare. Jessica suddenly lunged at me across the table, either out of rage or fear. Luckily, my husband and other family members quickly restrained her. 10 minutes later, the police arrived and forcefully escorted her out. She continued to hurl insults, but by the time she was put into the patrol car, she had lost all her spirit. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. Later, I found out that Jessica ended up in prison. Our report of the incident was accepted, and it turned out that she had a large amount of debt from loan sharks. Her obsession with Charlotte's inheritance was due to this hidden problem. Despite everything, Jessica will have a tough life ahead, and she won't see the light of day again. As we cleaned up and organized our home, my husband offered incense in front of his mother's portrait and said, "I was surprised to see you argue so bravely, Kristen." I replied, "That's because I read mother-in-law's will again." The day before talking to Jessica, I had taken the time to thoroughly read the will. It was filled with Charlotte's heartfelt words, almost like a personal letter. She had always worried about her daughter and had no grudges. She hoped for our happiness as a couple and wanted to do many things for her real daughter. Holding my cardigan tightly, I started to cry thinking about my mother-in-law. My husband, seeing me like that, tried to cheer me up. "Kristen, would you knit something for me too?" "Sure," I said, wiping away my tears with a smile. "I'll show you mother-in-law's knitting technique." From then on, I vowed in my heart to live a happy life, honoring Charlotte's memory and making good use of her inheritance.